Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind noisy cities, towering castles, and emperors who thought having 50 different titles somehow made them more interesting. Instead, we're following the slow footsteps of the nomads who spent centuries wandering the endless grasslands of Central Asia, carrying nearly everything they owned on the backs of horses, camels, and the occasional stubborn goat that clearly had its own opinions. Now, if someone today told you they planned to spend months crossing deserts with nothing but a tent, a flock of sheep, and enough woven rugs to furnish a palace, you might gently suggest they reconsider their vacation plans. But for countless families traveling along the Silk Road, this wasn't an adventure. It was simply Tuesday. Tonight we'll discover how these remarkable people transformed wool, silk, camel hair, and endless patience into carpets so intricate that merchants carried them across continents. Some eventually decorated Persian palaces, others found their way into Byzantine churches, Venetian mansions, Chinese temples, and even the homes of European nobles who probably never imagined their prized carpet had once been rolled up beside a grazing camel somewhere on the Eurasian steppe. Along the way, we'll meet tribal elders, master weavers, wandering merchants, suspicious tax collectors, ambitious khans, unlucky thieves, and rulers who discovered that conquering the steppe was considerably easier than convincing nomads to stay in one place. We'll also spend plenty of time with ordinary families, the women whose fingers tied millions of tiny knots, the children who learned patterns before they could read, and the shepherds who quietly supplied the wool that made the entire tradition possible. As always, this isn't a story of nonstop battles and dramatic speeches. History has plenty of those already. Instead, this is the slower history, hidden between famous events. The history of daily work, quiet craftsmanship, long caravan journeys, freezing winters, scorching deserts, and the remarkable patience required to knot thousands upon thousands of threads into a single carpet, which, if we're being fair, is probably one of humanity's greatest demonstrations that people will dedicate astonishing amounts of time to making floors look slightly more impressive. So dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair, maybe grab a blanket that's considerably easier to make than a 10th century Turkic carpet, and let's travel back more than 1,000 years to the vast open world of the Silk Road, where every knot told a story, every pattern carried a memory, and every caravan disappearing over the horizon might be carrying the next masterpiece. Chapter 1. Before the Silk Road. Life on the Eurasian steppe long before merchants argued over the price of silk in bustling markets, before camel caravans stretched across deserts like slow-moving rivers, and before anyone had the clever idea of connecting east and west through thousands of miles of trade routes, there was the steppe. It didn't belong to one kingdom, it didn't belong to one emperor. Barely tolerated the people who tried to claim it. Imagine standing on an open plain where the horizon seems impossibly far away. There are no towering city walls to guide your eyes, no church bells, no crowded marketplaces, just endless waves of grass rolling beneath an enormous sky that changes color almost by the hour. The wind is never entirely quiet here. If anything, the wind is the oldest resident of the Eurasian steppe. It whistles through dry grass in summer, pushes heavy snow across the ground in winter, and occasionally reminds everyone that nature has absolutely no interest in respecting your carefully arranged campsite. For thousands of years, this immense grassland stretched from the edges of Eastern Europe all the way into Mongolia. It crossed what are now Ukraine, southern Russia, Kazakhstan, parts of Uzbekistan, Mongolia, and northern China. It was one of the largest continuous ecosystems on Earth, and unlike many landscapes shaped by forests or mountains, it seemed almost endless. That endlessness changed people. A farmer living beside a river measures life by fields. A fisherman measures life by tides. A sailor watches the stars. But a nomad living on the steppe learned to measure life by grass. Grass meant food. Food meant animals. Animals meant survival. Without healthy pasture, even the richest family could become desperately poor within a single difficult season. It sounds surprisingly simple, and in many ways, it was. Of course, simplicity rarely meant comfort. The weather on the steppe could change with astonishing speed. A warm afternoon might suddenly become a freezing evening. Dust storms could swallow entire camps. Blizzards sometimes arrived with almost no warning, burying grazing animals beneath thick layers of snow. Modern weather forecasts struggle enough with tomorrow afternoon. The ancient steppe offered no forecasts at all, only experience. Families learned to read tiny signs, invisible to outsiders, clouds gathering unusually, low birds flying in unexpected directions, the behavior of horses, the smell carried by the wind. Small clues often determined whether an entire camp packed its belongings immediately or remained where it stood. Sometimes the decision meant life. Sometimes it meant death. Long before written history described these people, small communities had already adapted themselves to this enormous landscape. Archaeologists believe pastoral lifestyles slowly developed over thousands of years as communities realized that raising animals across open grasslands offered far greater opportunities than trying to farm soil that often refused to cooperate. Fields could fail, grass moved, and so did the people. Instead of building permanent stone houses, many families lived in portable homes that could be dismantled surprisingly quickly. Wooden frames supported thick layers of felt made from sheep's wool. The structures were warm during bitter winters and remarkably cool during hot summers. They could even be packed onto wagons, pulled by oxen or camels. Imagine moving your entire house every few weeks. Now, imagine doing it without losing the cooking pot. Quite an achievement. Honestly, these portable homes were practical masterpieces. Inside, every object had its place. Blankets were carefully folded, storage chests protected valuable possessions. Weapons rested near the entrance. Cooking equipment stayed close to the central hearth. Most importantly for our story, beautifully woven textiles decorated walls, floors, and sleeping areas. Even before the famous Silk Road existed, weaving already formed part of everyday life. Not because people wanted fashionable interior decoration, because woven fabrics made survival easier. Thick textiles insulated homes against bitter winds. Blankets protected sleeping families. Decorated bags carried supplies. Strong, woven straps secured heavy loads during migration. Practical objects slowly became beautiful objects. Beauty arrived quietly. Nobody woke one morning, announcing they had invented fine art. Instead, generations improved simple techniques. One family experimented with tighter weaving. Another discovered stronger yarn. Someone noticed certain plants created richer colors. Another learned that sheep grazing in particular valleys produced softer wool. Knowledge accumulated one careful improvement at a time. The earliest nomadic communities probably never imagined that centuries later their descendants would produce carpets admired across continents. At the time, they simply wanted warmer floors, which, if you've ever stepped barefoot onto frozen ground, is remarkably understandable ambition. The animals themselves shaped every aspect of daily life. Horses transformed mobility. Sheep supplied wool. Goats provided coarse fibers. Camels carried astonishingly heavy loads across dry landscapes. Cattle offered milk, meat, and strength. Every animal had value. Every animal demanded constant attention. Shepherd's day often began before sunrise. Children helped gather livestock. Adults inspected grazing areas. Water sources were checked. Predators left tracks during the night. Nothing could be ignored. Wolves watched constantly. Snow leopards hunted mountain edges. Foxes searched for smaller prey. Even harsh weather sometimes killed more animals than predators ever managed. Losing livestock was not simply disappointing, it threatened entire families. Wealth wasn't counted in coins, it walked on 4 legs. The richest household might own hundreds of sheep, dozens of horses, and several camels. The poorest might struggle to keep only a few animals alive through winter. Status followed the herd. So did responsibility. As communities moved seasonally across familiar migration routes, they formed relationships with neighboring tribes. Sometimes they traded peacefully. Sometimes they competed for grazing land. Sometimes both happened within the same afternoon. Human nature has always enjoyed keeping things interesting. Despite occasional conflicts, these early societies developed surprisingly sophisticated customs. Hospitality became sacred. A traveler arriving at camp usually received food before questions. Guests represented news from distant lands. They carried stories, rumors, warnings, songs, occasionally exaggerated hunting tales that somehow grew larger with every retelling. It turns out fishermen were not the only people capable of creative measurements. Storytelling became one of the greatest treasures carried across the grasslands. Without widespread writing, history survived inside memory. Elders recited genealogies stretching back generations. Children memorized heroic legends. Poets composed verses celebrating great migrations, successful hunts, tragic losses, and respected ancestors. Patterns found later in carpets often echoed these oral traditions. A symbol might represent a mountain. Another recalled an ancient clan. A repeated geometric shape preserved memories of animals, rivers, stars, or protective spirits. The carpet became more than decoration. It became memory made visible. This way of thinking emerged long before international trade connected distant civilizations. People living on the steppe already understood something profound. Objects could carry stories, not written stories, woven stories. The rhythm of everyday life followed the seasons with remarkable precision. Spring brought newborn animals and fresh grass. Summer offered long migrations across rich pasture. Autumn demanded preparation. Winter tested every decision made throughout the year. There was little room for laziness. Nature noticed carelessness immediately. A forgotten tool, a poorly secured tent, an overlooked water source. Small mistakes became enormous problems surprisingly fast. Yet despite these hardships, many travelers who later visited nomadic camps expressed admiration. They described generous hosts, excellent horsemen, skilled hunters, talented musicians, expert craftspeople whose woven textiles rivaled the finest products of settled kingdoms. These observations would become even more significant after trade routes expanded across Eurasia, because while cities often produced luxury goods behind workshop walls, nomadic families created masterpieces while living beneath open skies. Their workshops moved with the seasons. Their classrooms traveled beside the herds. Their apprentices learned by watching parents and grandparents every single day. No grand academy issued certificates. No royal guild approved new weavers. Experience remained the greatest teacher, and patience remained the greatest skill. A single beautiful textile might require weeks or even months of careful work. Thousands of tiny decisions, thousands of individual threads, thousands of opportunities to make mistakes. Yet generation after generation continued weaving. Not because history would remember them. Most never expected history to know their names. They worked because families needed warm homes, because traditions deserved preserving, because beauty mattered, even on the edge of an endless grassland, where tomorrow's campsite might lie 50 miles away. The Great Silk Road had not yet appeared. No massive caravans crossed these plains carrying silk from China or spices from India. No wealthy merchants negotiated fortunes in distant bazaars. But the foundations already existed. The people, the animals, the migrations, the skills, the patience. The woven traditions quietly passed from parent to child. When trade finally transformed, Eurasia centuries later, the nomads would already possess something merchants desperately wanted. Not gold, not silver, not precious gems. Something far more patient. The knowledge of how to transform humble wool into extraordinary works of art, one careful knot at a time. And that quiet tradition, born beneath the vast skies of the Eurasian steppe. Stuart would eventually travel farther than almost anyone could have imagined. If you'd like, I can continue with Chapter 2, the first nomadic shepherds, in the same relaxing, conversational, slightly sarcastic style. Chapter 2, the first nomadic shepherds. As the first pale light crept across the endless Eurasian steppe, long before the Silk Road carried silk, spices, or stories between distant civilizations, another journey was already underway. It wasn't the journey of merchants. It wasn't the march of conquering armies. It was the quiet, patient walk of shepherds, guiding their animals toward fresh grass. There were no grand monuments announcing their importance, no royal scribes hurriedly recording their names. If history had relied only on written records, we might have assumed these people hardly existed at all. Fortunately, the land remembers what ink forgets. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient campsites, stone tools polished smooth by generations of hands, animal bones showing clear signs of careful herding, and fragments of woven textiles preserved by extraordinary luck. These scattered clues reveal a remarkable transformation that began nearly 6,000 years ago, when communities across the vast grasslands slowly shifted from hunting wild animals to raising them. It wasn't an overnight revolution. Human history rarely works that neatly. Instead, it unfolded over countless seasons, one practical decision at a time. Perhaps a family noticed that tame sheep stayed close to camp and provided reliable wool. Perhaps another realized that goats willingly followed familiar paths instead of disappearing into distant hills. Someone almost certainly spent weeks trying to convince a particularly stubborn animal that cooperation was everyone's best option. The animal probably disagreed. Some debates, it seems, are timeless. As more families embraced herding, life itself began to change. Hunting remained important, but it was no longer the only way to secure food. A healthy flock offered milk, meat, wool, hides, and eventually enough offspring to expand the herd. Animals became walking storehouses of survival. Every birth meant hope. Every illness brought worry. Every winter demanded careful planning. Unlike farmers tied to fields, shepherds followed opportunity wherever the grass grew tallest. Their lives became a rhythm of movement, guided by the changing seasons. In spring, newborn lambs stumbled across fresh pastures under watchful eyes. During the warm months, families traveled to higher grazing grounds where the grass remained green. Autumn became a race against time as everyone prepared for the harsh winter ahead. Winter, meanwhile, had a personality all its own. It was rarely friendly. Across the open steppe, icy winds swept unhindered for hundreds of miles. Snow could bury grazing land beneath thick drifts, making food nearly impossible to reach. Modern historians even have a name for particularly devastating winters in Central Asia, Dzud. During these brutal seasons, ice trapped grass beneath frozen layers, and entire herds sometimes starved, despite standing on fields that appeared full of food. The shepherds learned difficult lessons. Store extra fodder whenever possible. Never trust a mild autumn. Keep the strongest animals healthy. And perhaps most importantly, always assume the weather is capable of becoming much worse. Optimism is admirable. Extra firewood is usually more useful. The horse soon became the shepherd's greatest companion, long before cavalry charges filled history books. Horses transformed ordinary daily life. A rider could travel far beyond the distance possible on foot, searching for better pasture or recovering wandering livestock before they disappeared over the horizon. Some historians believe the peoples of the Eurasian steppe were among the first to fully master horseback riding. At first, horses were probably valued for meat and milk, but gradually, people discovered something extraordinary. A horse wasn't simply another animal, it was freedom. Mounted shepherds could oversee enormous herds spread across vast grasslands. They became faster than wolves, quicker than rival raiders, and far more efficient than anyone traveling on foot. Children learned to ride astonishingly young. Travelers centuries later often remarked that boys and girls seemed almost born in the saddle. To outsiders, this looked impressive. To the families themselves, it simply made sense. When your entire world moves across hundreds of miles every year, learning to ride is rather less optional than learning to politely decline dessert. Alongside horses came sheep, goats, cattle, and eventually the sturdy Bactrian camel, with its distinctive two humps. Unlike its one-humped cousin from Arabia, the Bactrian camel thrived in the cold deserts and rugged climates of Central Asia. It carried heavy loads across mountains and dry plains, patiently enduring conditions that would exhaust many other animals. Patient, of course, did not necessarily mean cheerful. Camels have long possessed a remarkable talent for expressing mild disappointment with humanity. The relationship between shepherd and herd demanded constant attention. Every morning began with counting animals. Every evening ended the same way. One missing sheep might indicate a wolf. Several missing sheep could suggest thieves. Both possibilities guaranteed an unpleasant day. Predators prowled the edges of camp. Gray wolves followed migration routes with remarkable intelligence. They understood that shepherds eventually grew tired, that storms reduced visibility, and that frightened animals often strayed from the flock. The contest between wolves and shepherds continued year after year. Neither side ever truly won. Instead, both became experts. Guard dogs emerged as invaluable allies. Large, fearless, and fiercely loyal, they patrolled camps through the night, while families slept inside warm felt tents. A good livestock dog was worth far more than its size suggested. It didn't weave carpets, but it certainly protected the sheep that produced the wool. Without sheep, there would be no yarn. Without yarn, there would be no weaving. Without weaving, well, this documentary would have taken a very different direction. Life on the move demanded extraordinary organization. Everything had to be portable. Cooking pots, storage chests, blankets, tools, weapons, looms, and woven bags all traveled together. Nothing unnecessary survived for long. Every extra object added weight. Every unnecessary weight slowed migration. Efficiency became second nature. This constant movement shaped the minds of the shepherds just as much as it shaped their camps. They learned to notice distant clouds, subtle changes in grass color, the health of streams, and the behavior of animals. A shepherd who ignored such details rarely remained a successful shepherd for long. Knowledge passed quietly between generations. Fathers taught sons where the best summer grazing lay hidden beyond distant hills. Mothers showed daughters how to spin wool while riding slowly beside the flock. Grandparents recited stories, explaining why certain valleys should be avoided after heavy snowfall, or why particular rivers became dangerous during spring floods. Some lessons sounded practical, others sounded mythical. Often, they were both. Many communities believed spirits watched over mountains, rivers, and grazing lands. Small rituals accompanied seasonal migrations. Offerings might be left near sacred springs. Elders whispered blessings before moving camp. Whether these traditions truly influenced nature remains impossible to prove. They certainly influenced people. Shared rituals strengthened communities facing unpredictable lives. Around evening fires, after animals had settled and meals were finished, the shepherds relaxed. Music echoed across the open plain. Stringed instruments, simple flutes, and human voices carried surprisingly far beneath the enormous night sky. Stories filled the darkness. Heroes battled monsters. Wise women outwitted greedy rulers. Ancestors overcame impossible winters. Children listened carefully. Tomorrow they would help with the flock again. But tonight they traveled through imagination. Those stories often found another home. not only in memory, in patterns. Simple geometric designs began appearing on woven belts, saddle blankets, storage bags, and eventually larger textiles. Zigzags might recall flowing rivers. Diamonds represented fertility or protection. Stylized horns honored powerful rams. Repeating motifs reminded families of mountains, stars, or ancestral clans. Every design carried meaning. Every color reflected careful choices. Although the magnificent carpets of later centuries had not yet emerged, their ancestors were already taking shape thread by thread. The first shepherds were unknowingly creating an artistic language that would survive for millennia. As populations grew, neighboring tribes met more frequently. Sometimes they exchanged breeding animals to strengthen herds. Sometimes they traded salt, stone tools, leather, and woven goods. Occasionally they exchanged insults. Instead, human diplomacy, as always, included a little variety. These growing networks gradually linked distant communities across the immense grasslands. Information spread surprisingly quickly. News of favorable grazing lands, dangerous diseases, successful breeding techniques, or approaching rival groups traveled with migrating families. Without realizing it, the shepherds were laying the foundations for something far greater than seasonal migration. They were creating pathways, invisible at first, repeated year after year, generation after generation, the same valleys, the same river crossings, the same mountain passes. Centuries later, merchants would use many of these established routes when transporting silk, jade, spices, precious metals, and fine textiles across Eurasia. Long before the Silk Road had a name, shepherds had already mapped much of its living geography with hoof prints instead of ink. Perhaps that is one of history's quietest ironies. The world's most famous trade network did not begin with wealthy merchants or ambitious emperors. It began with ordinary families, following hungry sheep toward greener grass. Their names rarely appeared in chronicles. Their faces remain unknown. Yet, their choices reshaped continents. Every migration taught them new landscapes. Every flock produced fresh wool. Every season refined ancient skills, and somewhere, perhaps beside a crackling evening fire, while children slept and sheep rested nearby, someone patiently twisted wool into yarn, preparing the materials that would eventually become the extraordinary carpets carried across the Silk Road. The merchants would receive much of the glory. The carpets would earn the admiration. But it was the shepherds, the quiet caretakers of the grasslands, who made that beauty possible from the very beginning. Chapter 3. Wool, silk, and camel hair. By now, the first rays of morning have spread across the grasslands, and somewhere in a nomadic camp, the day has already begun. Oak kettle hangs over a small fire. The horses are shaking the night's frost from their manes. Sheep are bleating with remarkable confidence for creatures that seem determined to wander into trouble every few minutes, and tucked inside a warm felt tent, a weaver is running practiced fingers through a bundle of freshly cleaned wool. It doesn't look particularly impressive, certainly not like the luxurious carpets that will one day decorate royal palaces from Persia to Constantinople. At first glance, it's simply a pile of fluffy fibers. History has a funny habit of hiding extraordinary things inside very ordinary-looking materials. Long before a single knot could be tied into an intricate carpet, the nomads first had to understand the remarkable gifts provided by their animals. Every tribe depended upon them not only for food and transport, but also for the raw materials that would keep families warm, decorate their homes, and eventually become some of the finest textiles traded along the Silk Road. Among all those materials, one stood above the rest: wool, soft, strong, warm, remarkably forgiving. If wool could speak, it would probably spend most of history politely reminding everyone that civilization owes it considerably more appreciation. Sheep had accompanied pastoral communities for thousands of years before the Silk Road ever emerged. At first, their greatest value lay in meat and milk. Yet generation after generation, herders noticed something else. Every spring, the animals grew heavy with thick winter fleeces, and every spring, those fleeces could be removed without harming the sheep. Quite a convenient arrangement. Really, the sheep kept growing more wool. The people kept making more textiles. Everyone, except perhaps the shepherd, responsible for chasing runaway sheep across half the steppe, benefited from the arrangement. Shearing became one of the most important seasonal events in the nomadic calendar. As the weather warmed, families gathered together to clip away the dense fleece using sharp bronze or iron shears. Earlier generations probably relied on stone blades or simple cutting tools, carefully removing the wool by hand. The work demanded patience. Cut too deeply, and the animal might be injured. Cut too unevenly, and valuable fibers could be wasted. Experienced shepherds moved quickly but gently, calming nervous sheep, while removing the fleece in large pieces whenever possible. The sheep, for their part, rarely seemed especially grateful, but one can hardly blame them. An unexpected haircut is still an unexpected haircut. Freshly shorn wool looked surprisingly dirty. It contained dust, bits of dry grass, burrs, tiny twigs, and a sticky natural grease called lanolin. To modernize, it hardly resembled the clean yarn sold in craft shops. Fortunately, ancient weavers possessed plenty of experience. The wool was washed repeatedly in streams or rivers, carefully cleaned, then spread beneath the open sky to dry. Women often worked together, chatting while sorting fibers into different qualities. The longest fibers became the strongest yarn. The shortest pieces found other uses. Nothing useful was discarded. Waste belonged to wealthy kingdoms. Nomads preferred practicality. After drying came another important task: carding, using comb-like tools covered with fine teeth. The fibers were brushed until they lay neatly parallel. Tangles disappeared, dust vanished, soft. Clouds of wool slowly transformed into smooth rolls, ready for spinning. Watching this process today can feel almost hypnotic. Brush, turn, brush, again, repeat. It is exactly the sort of slow, repetitive rhythm that reminds you why handmade carpets took months instead of weekends. Once carded, the wool passed into the hands of the spinner. With remarkable skill, women twisted loose fibers into long threads using simple drop spindles. The spindle spun gracefully beneath their fingers, drawing the fibers into strong, even yarn. It looks deceptively easy. It isn't. Maintaining consistent thickness over hundreds of meters required extraordinary practice. A beginner produced lumpy thread. A master spinner produced yarn so even that later weavers could create astonishingly precise patterns. Many girls began learning these techniques before reaching their teenage years. By adulthood, their hands worked almost automatically. Conversation continued. Children played nearby. Livestock wandered outside. The spindle kept turning, Some historians believe experienced women could spin yarn while walking beside migrating herds. Considering how many everyday tasks nomadic families mastered simultaneously, this seems entirely believable. Human beings have always possessed a remarkable talent for becoming astonishingly competent when absolutely necessary. Yet wool was not the only treasure available on the great grasslands. Another remarkable material came from an animal perfectly suited to the harsh climates of Central Asia, the Bactrian camel. Unlike the sleek one-humped camels crossing Arabian deserts, the two-humped Bactrian camel carried thick coats capable of surviving bitter winters where temperatures plunged far below freezing. Every spring these camels naturally shed their soft undercoat. Rather than cutting it away, families often gathered the loose fibers by combing the animals. The result was one of the finest natural fibers available anywhere. Camel hair possessed unique qualities. It was incredibly warm, exceptionally light, naturally insulating, soft enough for luxurious garments, yet durable enough for blankets and fine textiles. Its colors ranged from pale golden cream to deep reddish brown, creating beautiful natural shades without requiring dyes. Not every family owned camels. Those who did guarded them carefully. A healthy camel represented transportation, wealth, and valuable fiber all at once. Rather an overachiever, really. While sheep supplied the majority of wool for carpets, camel hair often appeared in finer decorative pieces, tent furnishings, robes, and sometimes as delicate highlights woven into more elaborate textiles. Its natural softness made it especially prized among skilled craftspeople. Then there was silk, the material whose very name would eventually define the Silk Road itself. Interestingly, the nomadic tribe did not originally produce silk. That secret belonged largely to China. For centuries, Chinese silk production remained one of the ancient world's best-kept industrial secrets. Silkworms fed exclusively upon mulberry leaves before spinning astonishingly fine cocoons. Those delicate fibers, carefully unwound and twisted, together produced thread unlike anything else available. Smooth, strong, lustrous, almost impossibly light. Chinese rulers understood its value perfectly. Silk became diplomacy. Silk became taxation. Silk became imperial wealth. More importantly for ambitious merchants, silk became profit, enormous profit. When early caravans gradually expanded across Asia, bolts of shimmering silk eventually reached the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. At first, these textiles were rare luxuries. Only powerful tribal leaders, wealthy families, or successful merchants could afford significant quantities. Imagine seeing silk for the first time after spending your life surrounded mainly by wool, leather, and felt. The fabric almost seemed magical. It shimmered differently beneath sunlight. It flowed differently. It felt cool against the skin. No wonder travelers described it with admiration. Naturally, skilled nomadic weavers soon began experimenting. Rather than replacing wool, silk complemented it. Small silk details, highlighted borders, bright decorative elements emphasized important symbols. Occasionally, entire luxury carpets incorporated silk threads to increase brilliance and prestige. The results were breathtaking. Persian merchants eagerly purchased such textiles. Chinese officials admired them. Royal courts competed to own them. Meanwhile, The original weavers were probably wondering whether the caravan might return before winter, with more dye plants and perhaps a few extra cooking pots. History often remembers the kings. It should probably spend more time thanking the artisans. Different fibers demanded different techniques. Wool accepted dyes beautifully. Camel hair often displayed attractive natural shades. Silk reflected light in extraordinary ways. Master weavers learned exactly how each behaved beneath tension. Some fibers stretched, others remained firm, some absorbed color deeply, others produced softer tones. Experience mattered more than written instructions. There were no instructional manuals titled Advanced Carpet Weaving for busy nomads, although one suspects they would have sold rather well. Every material carried cultural meaning. Sheep symbolized prosperity, camels represented endurance, silk suggested wealth and distant connections. A finished carpet quietly reflected all these stories simultaneously. It spoke without words. A visitor entering a tent could often judge a family's prosperity simply by observing the textiles surrounding them. Fine weaving suggested skilled hands. Rich colors implied access to expensive dyes. Silk indicated successful trade. Large carpets hinted at abundant wool and considerable labor. Nothing announced these achievements directly. The carpets simply whispered them. Perhaps that quiet confidence made them even more impressive. The fibers also connected generations. Grandmothers taught daughters. Daughters taught granddaughters. Boys often learned animal care, while girls mastered spinning and weaving. Though responsibilities frequently overlapped depending upon each family's needs, knowledge remained alive because it was practiced daily, not because anyone wrote it down. Every strand carried invisible lessons accumulated across centuries. How tightly to spin, how quickly to wash, when to shear. Which camel produced the softest fiber? Which sheep survived harsh winters best? Small observations became traditions. Traditions became expertise. Expertise became masterpieces as evening settled across the steppe once again. Bundles of newly spun yarn rested neatly inside felt tents. Outside, sheep grazed peacefully beneath fading sunlight. Camels knelt beside loaded packs. Horses cropped the last fresh grass of the day. The raw materials of history waited patiently. Soon they would meet natural dyes, sturdy wooden looms, and the remarkably patient hands of master weavers. Thread by thread, color by color, knot by knot, the humble gifts of sheep, silkworms, and camels would begin their slow transformation into carpets destined to cross deserts, decorate palaces, survive centuries, and quietly tell the story of the nomads who first understood that even the simplest fibers could become something extraordinary. Chapter 4: Why Every Tribe Needed Carpets. If you've ever walked into a cozy home on a cold winter evening, you've probably noticed something before anything else. Not the furniture, not the decorations, the warmth. That feeling of comfort doesn't happen by accident. For the nomadic tribes of the Eurasian steppe, warmth wasn't simply pleasant, it was survival. And surprisingly, one of the greatest tools for staying alive wasn't a weapon, a horse, or even a sturdy tent. It was a carpet. Now, today we tend to think of carpets as something that quietly sits on the floor, collecting crumbs until someone reluctantly drags out the vacuum cleaner. Ancient nomads would have found that idea almost hilarious. To them, a carpet was never just a carpet. It was insulation. It was furniture. It was luggage. It was art. It was wealth. It was memory. Sometimes it was even a family's most valuable possession. Life on the steppe demanded practical thinking. Every item had to earn its place because everything had to travel. A family might migrate hundreds of miles during a single year, following the seasons from one grazing ground to another. If something served only one purpose, it was a luxury. If it served 5 or 6 purposes, it became essential. Carpets belonged firmly in the second category. When a family reached a new campsite, one of the first tasks after raising the felt tent was preparing the interior. Thick, woven carpets were carefully unrolled across the ground, covering the bare earth beneath. The difference was immediate. Without carpets, cold seeped upward through the soil, especially during the long winters of Central Asia. Thick wool trapped warm air, creating an insulating layer between the family and the frozen ground. The floor became softer, warmer, far more welcoming. Sleeping directly on frozen earth might sound unpleasant. That's because it was. A well-made carpet could mean the difference between a comfortable night's rest and a miserable one. And anyone who has tried sleeping on hard ground knows that after about 10 minutes, even a slightly lumpy carpet begins to feel like a luxury fit for royalty. Inside the portable homes, known today by names such as the yurt or gir, depending on the region, carpets covered much more than the floor. Some hung along the walls, adding another layer of insulation against icy winds. Others divided the interior into separate spaces. One section might be reserved for guests, another for sleeping, another for storing food or valuable belongings. The carpets softened both sound and temperature, making the tent feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a true home. That sense of home mattered deeply. Nomadic families spent much of their lives moving across immense landscapes. Villages did not stay behind them. Their homes traveled with them. Every time they assembled a tent and unrolled familiar carpets, they recreated a piece of their world, no matter how distant the location. Imagine seeing the same woven patterns every evening after weeks of travel. The same colors, the same symbols, the same designs your grandparents had admired years before. Those carpets became anchors in an ever-changing landscape. They reminded families who they were. They reminded children where they belonged. And perhaps they reminded everyone that, yes, the left corner always seemed to curl upward, no matter how carefully it was rolled. Some traditions never change. Carpets also served as furniture in ways that might surprise modern viewers. Most nomadic homes contained relatively little heavy furniture. Chairs were uncommon. Large tables would only complicate travel. Instead, families sat directly upon layered carpets and cushions. Meals were shared on them. Children played on them. Guests were welcomed onto them. Important conversations unfolded there. Marriage negotiations, storytelling, celebrations, even moments of mourning. A single carpet might witness the entire history of one family across several generations. It became the silent observer of everyday life. As evening settled over the steppe, elders gathered around the central hearth, while younger members of the family listened to stories. Flames flickered against richly woven patterns, casting moving shadows that danced across the tent walls. Outside, the wind might howl across the grasslands. Inside, thick carpets helped keep the warmth where it belonged. It is easy to admire the beauty of ancient textiles in museums today. It is harder, but perhaps more important, to remember that they were once deeply practical objects used every single day. Beauty and usefulness existed side by side. In many nomadic societies, there was little separation between craftsmanship and necessity. Why make something plain if careful hands could make it beautiful as well? After all, if you were already spending months weaving thousands of knots, adding a few elegant patterns probably seemed like a reasonable investment. Carpets also protected precious belongings. Storage chests often rested upon thick, woven layers that kept moisture away from wood and leather. Bundles of clothing were wrapped in textiles before being tied onto pack animals. Fragile household objects traveled inside woven bags designed to survive rough journeys across mountains and deserts. Every thread contributed to survival. Then there were the animals. Ironically, some of the finest woven pieces spent plenty of time nowhere near the inside of a tent. Special blankets covered horses during cold weather. Decorated saddlecloths protected valuable riding equipment. Camels carried elaborately woven packs that balanced heavy loads while enduring endless miles of travel. A wealthy caravan crossing Central Asia could become a moving exhibition of textile craftsmanship. Even the animals looked remarkably well dressed. One suspects the camels appreciated practicality more than fashion, but they carried both anyway. As trade slowly expanded across Eurasia, carpets gained another role. They became currency. Not official coins, of course, but highly valuable goods that could be exchanged for grain, metal tools, salt, weapons, tea, spices, or silk. A masterfully woven carpet represented months of skilled labor. Merchants recognized its worth immediately. Unlike fresh food, a well-made carpet could survive long journeys. Unlike fragile pottery, it could be rolled tightly for transport. Unlike precious metals, it carried beauty alongside value. In many ways, it was the ideal trading commodity. Entire caravans eventually traveled with stacks of carefully wrapped carpets secured upon camels. From the outside, they looked like ordinary bundles. Inside lay hundreds of thousands of carefully tied knots. Each one represented countless hours of patient work. Each one carried the reputation of its makers. Patterns also communicated identity. Long before written labels or family crests became widespread across much of the region, carpets quietly announced where people came from. Certain tribes favored bold, geometric shapes. Others preferred repeating floral motifs. Some incorporated stylized animal horns. Others emphasized stars, diamonds, or branching trees. An experienced trader could often recognize the origin of a carpet at a glance, much as wine experts today claim to identify obscure vineyards after a single sip. Whether they are always correct is another matter entirely. Within the tribe, these patterns carried emotional meaning. Children learned them almost unconsciously. A girl helping her mother spin yarn gradually memorized familiar motifs. A boy watching older relatives unpack camp recognized the same symbols year after year. The designs became part of community identity, not because someone ordered them to remember, because they lived surrounded by them. Carpets also played central roles during life's greatest milestones. When a child was born, carefully woven blankets wrapped the infant. When young couples married, specially prepared carpets often formed part of the dowry. The quality of the weaving reflected not only skill, but also family honor. Guests admired the craftsmanship. Relatives quietly evaluated every detail. No pressure at all. One slightly uneven border, and your aunt might be discussing it for the next 20 years. Human families have always excelled at preserving tiny observations indefinitely. During important tribal gatherings, the finest carpets emerged from storage. Leaders sat upon them during negotiations. Honored guests received places upon the most beautiful examples. Ceremonies unfolded atop textiles that represented generations of craftsmanship. These moments transformed ordinary woven objects into symbols of respect and authority. Some carpets became treasured heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter. Their colors faded slightly. Their edges showed signs of wear. Small repairs accumulated over decades, yet these imperfections only deepened their meaning. Every repaired corner told a story. Every faded thread reflected years of faithful use. A carpet that had traveled across hundreds of migrations possessed a history impossible to replace. Perhaps the greatest achievement of these textiles was something impossible to measure. They created comfort, not simply physical comfort, emotional comfort. A familiar carpet spread across the floor of a newly raised tent transformed unfamiliar ground into home. Children slept more peacefully. Elders recognized familiar surroundings. Travel felt less uncertain. In a world where nearly everything outside changed with the seasons, those woven patterns remained reassuringly constant. That quiet stability became one of the greatest luxuries a nomadic family could possess. Long before wealthy collectors displayed ancient carpets inside magnificent palaces, they had already fulfilled a far more important purpose. They had sheltered ordinary people, protected children from frozen ground, welcomed weary travelers, celebrated marriages, comforted the grieving, carried treasured belongings, recorded family traditions, and accompanied generations of nomads across one of the largest landscapes on Earth. The merchants, who later admired these carpets, often saw exquisite works of art. The nomads saw something even greater, home itself. And as our journey continues, we'll step inside the warm glow of one of those remarkable, portable homes, where every beam, every felt covering, and every carefully placed carpet worked together to create a sanctuary against the endless winds of the Eurasian steppe. Chapter 5. Inside a portable felt tent as the sun begins to sink below the endless horizon. The wind across the Eurasian steppe grows cooler. A caravan that has spent the entire day traveling finally slows to a halt. Horses lower their heads to graze. Camels let out deep, grumbling sounds that somehow manage to express both exhaustion and mild annoyance. Sheep spread across the nearby pasture with impressive enthusiasm, as though they have personally discovered the finest grass in all of Central Asia. For the people, however, another important task is only just beginning. They have to build an entire home. Not tomorrow, not next week. Right now. Fortunately, this is hardly unusual. Every member of the family knows exactly what to do. Years of practice have turned what might seem like an enormous project into a carefully rehearsed routine. Children carry smaller bundles. Teenagers help unload the wagons. Adults begin assembling the wooden framework with calm efficiency. Nobody needs lengthy instructions. Nobody consults a blueprint. There is certainly no one standing nearby saying, "I think this beam would look better over there." The step has little patience for unnecessary meetings. The portable felt tent, known today by names such as the yurt among Turkic peoples or the jur in Mongolia, was one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. Although it appeared simple from the outside, every piece had been refined over countless generations. It was strong enough to survive powerful winds, warm enough for freezing winters, cool enough during scorching summers, portable enough to dismantle in only a few hours. Even many modern camping enthusiasts would quietly admit that ancient nomads knew exactly what they were doing. The first part to rise was the circular lattice wall, made from lightweight wooden strips. Carefully joined together, the wall could expand like an enormous folding fan. Once opened into a complete circle, it formed the sturdy foundation of the structure. There was something elegant about its design, flexible, strong, easy to transport, exactly the qualities that nomadic life demanded. Next came the doorway. Unlike the rest of the tent, the door was solid wood, often beautifully carved by skilled craftsmen. Some wealthy families decorated their doors with painted patterns or geometric designs, transforming an ordinary entrance into a quiet display of artistry. The doorway usually faced south or southeast. This simple decision served several practical purposes. Morning sunlight warmed the interior. Cold northern winds stayed mostly behind the tent. The first light of dawn gently entered the home. Nature itself became part of the architecture. Then came, perhaps, the most impressive step. Long roof poles stretched upward from the lattice walls toward a circular wooden ring at the center of the roof. This ring was far more than decoration. It supported the entire structure. It allowed smoke from the central fire to escape. It welcomed fresh air into the tent. And on clear nights, it framed a perfect circle of stars overhead. Imagine lying beside a warm fire while looking directly into the night sky through the opening above. No glass ceiling, no electric lights, only countless stars stretching across the darkness. One can understand why so many ancient peoples filled the heavens with stories. The roof itself seemed to invite imagination. Once the wooden skeleton stood, complete, the family carefully covered it with thick sheets of felt. This remarkable material came almost entirely from sheep's wool. Freshly shorn wool was washed, cleaned, carded, layered, sprinkled with water, and rolled repeatedly until the fibers naturally locked together into dense fabric. Unlike woven cloth, felt contained no threads. Instead, millions of tiny wool fibers clung tightly together, creating a material that resisted wind, trapped warmth, and even shed light rain surprisingly well. It was, in many ways, nature's insulation. Layer after layer of felt transformed the wooden frame into a comfortable shelter capable of surviving extraordinary weather. During winter, thick walls trapped precious heat from the central fire. During summer, the felt reflected much of the sun's intense warmth, while allowing air to circulate through carefully adjusted openings. It was climate control without electricity. Not bad for a design perfected long before anyone complained about updating smartphone software. Heavy woven straps held everything securely in place. These straps were often beautifully decorated, proving once again that nomadic craftsmen saw no reason why practical objects couldn't also be beautiful. After all, if you have to look at the same tent every day, you might as well make it pleasant. Stepping inside, visitors entered a world that was both simple and surprisingly sophisticated. The floor disappeared beneath layers of carpets and woven mats. Soft, woolen textiles insulated the family from the cold ground below. Some carpets displayed bold tribal patterns. Others featured intricate borders filled with symbols passed down through generations. Every textile had a purpose. Every pattern carried meaning. The circular shape of the tent created a sense of harmony. Unlike square buildings with sharp corners, everything naturally flowed around the central hearth. The fire occupied the heart of the home. Meals were cooked there. Tea simmered gently over glowing embers. Stories unfolded beside its warmth. Children played nearby, while grandparents quietly spun yarn or repaired clothing. Smoke drifted upward through the roof opening, carrying with it the comforting smell of burning wood, simmering stew, fresh wool, and perhaps a hint of sheep that had wandered a little too close earlier in the day. Nomadic life was many things. Entirely odorless was not one of them. Despite the limited space, the interior followed careful traditions. The place directly opposite the entrance often belonged to honored guests or respected elders. Important possessions rested there as well. The right side of the tent frequently held tools, saddles, hunting equipment, and men's belongings. The left side often contained cooking utensils, spinning tools, weaving materials, and household supplies traditionally managed by women. These arrangements varied between different cultures and tribes, but organization remained remarkably consistent. When every object travels hundreds of miles each year, knowing exactly where everything belongs becomes rather important. Few people enjoy searching for a missing cooking pot, while an entire caravan waits outside. Along the walls stood painted wooden chests. Inside were folded garments, precious jewelry, family heirlooms, carefully wrapped silk fabrics acquired through trade, and perhaps the finest carpets reserved for important celebrations. Nothing was left carelessly scattered. Space was simply too valuable. Above, colorful woven bands circled the interior, strengthening the tent while adding vibrant decoration. Their reds, blues, ochres, deep greens, and warm browns echoed the landscapes outside. The colors weren't chosen randomly. Many came from natural dyes, produced using madder root, walnut husks, indigo, onion skins, wildflowers, and even tiny insects that produced brilliant crimson pigments. Nature itself painted the home. One of the most fascinating aspects of the felt tent was its adaptability. During fierce winter storms, additional felt layers could be wrapped around the exterior. During hot summers, coverings could be partially rolled upward, allowing cool breezes to circulate. The roof opening expanded or narrowed depending upon weather, conditions. The tent breathed with the seasons. Modern architects might describe this as passive, environmental design. The Nomads probably described it as common sense. Daily life unfolded within these circular walls. Women spun wool while watching. Men repaired harnesses or sharpened tools. Teenagers practiced writing skills before returning to help with evening chores. Grandparents became living libraries, sharing stories of famous migrations, harsh winters, heroic ancestors, mysterious travelers, and distant lands beyond the horizon. There were no printed books stacked neatly on shelves. History lived inside human memory. Sometimes those stories became songs. Sometimes they became embroidery. Sometimes they quietly found their way into the patterns woven into carpets. A diamond motif might recall an ancestral clan. A ram's horn represented strength. Flowing lines echoed. Rivers crossed long ago. Even after the original storytellers passed away, their memories continued beneath countless careful knots. Visitors were always important. Hospitality stood among the highest virtues of steppe society. A stranger arriving peacefully was usually invited inside without delay. Warm tea appeared. Fresh bread followed. Cheese, dried meat, fermented dairy, or roasted lamb might soon be offered. Only after the guest had eaten did serious questions begin. Who are you? Where have you traveled? What news do you bring? Had you encountered dangerous bandits? Were the mountain passes open? Was there good pasture farther east? Information traveled almost as quickly as caravans themselves. The felt tent became more than a home. It became a play where news crossed continents, merchants exchanged rumors. Travelers described distant kingdoms. Religious ideas spread quietly from conversation to conversation. Languages mixed, customs blended. Long before newspapers existed, the campfire served as the evening broadcast. Children listened wide-eyed as visitors spoke of glittering Persian cities, towering Chinese walls, frozen northern forests, and deserts so vast that one could travel for days without seeing another human being. Some stories were undoubtedly true. Others may have grown slightly more impressive with every retelling. Human imagination has always enjoyed adding just one more camel to every caravan. As darkness settled over the camp, the fire burned lower. Outside, wolves sometimes howled. Beyond the circle of grazing animals, guard dogs remained alert. The wind rustled the felt covering with a soft whisper. Inside, the family gradually settled onto thick carpets that generations of skilled hands had patiently created. Blankets were unfolded. Children drifted to sleep. The glowing embers cast gentle shadows across woven patterns that had become part of everyday life. Tomorrow, the camp might remain where it was, or perhaps the caravan would move once again, chasing greener grass beneath another enormous sky. Either way, the home would travel with them, piece by piece, beam by beam, carpet by carpet. The portable felt tent was far more than clever architecture. It was a symbol of a civilization that understood movement without chaos, simplicity without poverty, and comfort without permanence. Within its circular walls, generations of nomadic families laughed, argued, celebrated, mourned, worked, dreamed, and wove the magnificent carpets that would one day travel farther than they ever imagined. And waiting quietly beside one of those wooden chests sat a young girl, watching her mother prepare bundles of freshly spun yarn. Soon, her own hands would begin learning one of the oldest and most patient crafts on the steppe, the art of weaving. Chapter 7. Children learning ancient patterns. Morning arrives quietly on the Eurasian steppe. The first sunlight slips across the endless grass, turning every blade into a thread of gold. Dew sparkles briefly before the warming air carries it away. Somewhere outside the camp, horses snort softly as they begin another day of grazing. A shepherd whistles to his flock, while several sheep immediately pretend they have never heard a whistle in their entire lives. Some traditions, it seems, are older than recorded history. Inside the felt tent, however, the morning follows a different rhythm. There is no school bell, no rows of wooden desks, no blackboard covered with careful handwriting. Instead, a little girl sits cross-legged beside her mother, watching the loom with enormous concentration. Across from her, a young boy helps his grandmother untangle several bundles of dyed wool, trying very hard not to create a knot that future archaeologists might mistake for an ancient mystery. This is school, and today's lesson has already begun. For the nomadic tribes of Central Asia, education rarely took place in separate buildings. Children learned by living alongside the adults, watching every task unfold from the moment they were old enough to notice the world around them. Knowledge was not divided into subjects. History happened while spinning wool. Mathematics appeared while counting sheep. Art emerged during weaving. Geography revealed itself during migration. Science quietly accompanied every discussion about weather, animals, and plants. Everything connected. There was no clear line between work and learning. A child who spent years observing skilled weavers gradually absorbed hundreds of tiny details without realizing it. Which colors belonged together, how tightly yarn should be pulled, which patterns represented particular clans, when to stop and fix a mistake before it spread through the entire carpet. No one announced these lessons. They simply became part of everyday life. The youngest children usually began with observation. They sat nearby while adults worked, listening to conversations that drifted effortlessly between practical advice, family stories, local gossip, and ancient legends. Sometimes they grew bored. Sometimes they wandered outside to chase lambs or play games with friends. Yet somehow the information remained. Human children have always possessed remarkable ears. When adults assume they are not paying attention, by the age of 5 or 6, many children were already trusted with small responsibilities. One might carry clean wool from storage. Another sorted yarn by color. Someone else gathered loose threads from the floor so they could be reused. Simple tasks, important tasks. The adults understood, something modern educators continue to appreciate. Responsibility grows gradually. Nobody handed a 6-year-old responsibility for weaving an expensive ceremonial carpet. That would have ended rather dramatically. Instead, every new task built confidence. Success encouraged curiosity. Curiosity encouraged learning. One of the first skills children developed was recognizing patterns, not simply looking at them, understanding them. A carpet filled with geometric designs might appear decorative to an outsider. To the children growing up among those symbols, every shape carried meaning. The diamond represented protection. The ram's horn symbolized strength and prosperity. Flowing lines suggested rivers or life's continuous journey. Stars recalled the enormous night sky that stretched above the camp every evening. Some motifs represented fertility, others honored ancestors. Many reflected hopes for health, happiness, successful migrations, or abundant flocks. A child didn't memorize these meanings from a written list. They heard them in stories. Your grandmother wove this pattern before your mother was born. That border belongs to our family. This symbol reminds us of the valley where our ancestors survived the terrible winter. Slowly, the carpet became something far more than decoration. It became a storybook woven from wool. Even games became opportunities to learn. Children sometimes copied simple designs by arranging sticks, pebbles, or bits of colored thread on the ground. Older sisters challenged younger brothers to remember the correct sequence of repeating motifs. Grandparents occasionally pointed toward an old carpet and asked, "Can you find the mountain symbol?" The child searched carefully. There. And the river? There. And the ram's horn? A much longer silence followed. Learning rarely felt like formal instruction. It felt like family life. Of course, mistakes happened constantly. A young apprentice might place the wrong color in a border. Perhaps a row of knots leaned slightly to one side. Occasionally, someone forgot the pattern altogether and confidently invented something entirely new. Experienced weavers noticed immediately, not because they wished to criticize, because every mistake offered another lesson. Patient correction mattered more than perfect performance. Take it out. Try again. Look carefully. Now compare it with the row below. There was no embarrassment in making mistakes, only in refusing to learn from them. Some children progressed quickly, others needed more time. Families understood that every pair of hands developed differently. The goal was not speed. The goal was consistency. A carpet might survive for centuries. Rushing never helped. The loom itself fascinated many young learners. Standing taller than the smallest children, it seemed almost alive. Colorful yarn stretched between its beams. Threads crossed one another in careful order. Each completed row slowly revealed part of a hidden design. Watching a carpet emerge was rather like watching a sunrise. Nothing dramatic happened from one moment to the next. But after enough time, the entire world looked different. Many children eagerly waited for permission to tie their first real knot. It was an important milestone. Parents often watched closely. Grandparents offered gentle advice. The child wrapped the yarn, pulled it tight, trimmed the ends, then stepped back proudly. One knot out of perhaps 200,000. Everyone begins somewhere. Some surviving traditions even suggest that families celebrated these small achievements with quiet pride, not because the knot itself was extraordinary, because it represented the beginning of a lifelong skill. The education of children extended beyond weaving alone. While girls often spent more time learning, spinning, and carpet making, boys frequently accompanied shepherds across the grasslands, studying livestock, weather, and navigation. Yet these roles were never entirely separate. Many boys understood weaving. Many girls became excellent riders. Life on the steppe demanded flexibility above all else. If extra hands were needed, everyone helped. A family survived together. As children, grew older, they also learned the importance of color. Bundles of dyed wool became familiar companions. Deep red from madder root, golden yellow from wild plants, rich blue from indigo, traded across distant regions, soft brown from walnut husks, cream-colored wool left in its natural state. Each shade carried practical and symbolic significance. Children gradually discovered that colors spoke their own quiet language. Bright red suggested vitality. Blue often recalled the endless sky. Green hinted at spring pastures and renewal. White represented purity, fresh wool, or newly fallen snow. The steppe itself became their greatest teacher. During long migrations, children noticed repeating patterns everywhere. The zigzag of distant mountain ranges, the winding path of rivers, the symmetrical wings of birds soaring overhead, the spiral horns of wild sheep, the delicate shapes left by frost on winter mornings. Nature quietly offered endless inspiration. Later, those same forms appeared inside woven borders and central medallions. The landscape entered the carpet one memory at a time. Even evenings became classrooms. After supper, families gathered around the fire, while elders told stories, legends of wise rulers, tales of brave horsemen, accounts of mysterious travelers arriving from distant kingdoms. Children listened beneath blankets woven by earlier generations as flames flickered across the carpets covering the floor. The patterns seemed almost to move with the light. Perhaps that was why they remained so memorable. History became something children could both hear and see. Over many years, observation slowly transformed into mastery. The little girl who once sorted yarn now remembered complicated motifs without assistance. The boy who struggled to untangle thread could now recognize the work of neighboring tribes from a single border design. Neither realized how extraordinary their education truly was. To them, this was simply growing up. Centuries later, merchants crossing the Silk Road would marvel at the astonishing quality of Central Asian carpets. They admired the colors, the precision, the intricate geometry. Few paused to consider that every masterpiece began with a curious child sitting quietly beside an experienced weaver, learning not from books, but from patient eyes, steady hands, and stories passed gently from one generation to the next. The carpets carried the wisdom of entire families, not just the hands that tied the knots. And as those children became skilled young artisans themselves, another important lesson awaited them. Before a single thread could become a masterpiece, someone first had to build the loom, a deceptively simple wooden frame that would become the silent partner in every carpet ever woven across the great Eurasian steppe. Chapter 8. Building the Wooden Loom. The morning breeze drifts gently across the camp, carrying with it the familiar scents of fresh grass, wood smoke, and sheep that have once again managed to wander somewhere they probably shouldn't. A shepherd whistles in the distance. Several dogs spring into action. The sheep, naturally, look surprised that anyone expects them to stay together. Some things never change. Inside the largest felt tent, however, a very different kind of work is about to begin. No wool is being spun. No colorful yarn is stretched across waiting hands. Instead, several members of the family carefully lay long pieces of wood upon the carpeted floor. To an unfamiliar traveler, They might look like nothing more than ordinary beams, but to an experienced weaver, these pieces represent the beginning of something extraordinary. Before a single knot can be tied, before a pattern can emerge, before a carpet can begin telling its story, someone must first build the loom. The loom rarely receives the admiration given to the finished carpet. Visitors marvel at brilliant colors. Merchants praise intricate designs. Kings admire luxurious textiles. Almost no one stops to compliment the wooden frame that quietly made all of it possible. History often celebrates the performance while forgetting the stage. Yet without the loom, there would be no masterpiece. For the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, practicality guided every invention. Their homes traveled, their possessions traveled, even their workshops traveled. A loom had to satisfy several demanding requirements. It needed to be sturdy enough to withstand months of constant tension from tightly stretched threads. It had to be simple enough for repairs using basic tools. And perhaps most importantly, it needed to come apart whenever the tribe packed its camp and moved toward fresh pasture. A massive stone workshop would have been rather inconvenient, especially if someone expected the camels to carry it. Most nomadic looms were built from carefully selected hardwoods, gathered from river valleys, mountain forests, or traded from neighboring regions where suitable timber was more abundant. Wood itself was surprisingly valuable on the open steppe. Unlike grass, it did not grow everywhere. Every straight beam represented careful planning. Every smooth pole reflected patient craftsmanship. Families chose wood that resisted warping and cracking. After all, a crooked loom produced crooked work, and no master weaver wished to explain that an uneven carpet was simply the fault of a particularly opinionated tree. The basic structure appeared wonderfully simple. 2 upright posts, 2 horizontal beams, strong joints holding everything securely together. At first glance, it hardly looked sophisticated. Appearances can be wonderfully misleading. Every measurement mattered. If the frame leaned slightly to one side, the woven design slowly drifted out of alignment. If the beams flexed beneath pressure, thousands of carefully tied knots might become uneven. Tiny imperfections multiplied over time. A mistake made on the first day could remain visible years later. The builders understood this perfectly. Before assembly, each piece of wood was carefully inspected. Cracks, splinters, hidden weaknesses, anything that threatened stability was repaired or replaced. Experienced craftsmen ran rough hands along the grain, feeling for imperfections invisible to the eye. Years of experience had taught them something modern machines sometimes struggle to imitate. The human hand notices remarkable things. Construction usually became a family effort. One person steadied the uprights, another secured the crossbeams. Children gathered wooden pegs. Older relatives checked alignment. The atmosphere remained calm. Nobody rushed. A loom intended to support months of painstaking work deserved careful attention. Once the frame stood securely, the next task proved even more important. Stretching the warp threads. These long vertical threads formed the skeleton of the carpet itself. Everything else depended upon them. Imagine constructing a building without strong foundations. No matter how beautiful the walls became, The entire structure eventually failed. Warp threads served exactly that purpose. They carried the weight of every knot. They determined the carpet's shape. They preserved its strength for generations. Preparing them required astonishing precision. Each thread had to maintain nearly identical tension. Too loose, and the finished carpet sagged. Too tight, and the fibers risked snapping. The weavers adjusted each strand patiently, moving back and forth across the frame until every thread felt exactly right beneath their fingertips. No ruler measured the tension. No mechanical gauge offered helpful numbers. Experience served as the only instrument. One might call it instinct. Though instinct built upon 30 years of daily practice is rather more impressive than ordinary guessing. The warp itself was often made from especially strong wool, sturdy linen, or later, durable cotton obtained through expanding trade networks. Unlike the colorful yarn that created visible designs, these foundation threads remained mostly hidden inside the finished carpet, invisible, essential. Rather like good architecture or competent plumbing, people notice it most when something goes terribly wrong. After the warp came the horizontal weft threads. These would later weave back and forth between rows of knots, locking every section firmly into place. Together, warp and weft created a remarkably durable structure, capable of surviving decades, sometimes centuries of use. The simplicity of the design concealed extraordinary engineering. Every carpet depended upon balanced tension, distributed evenly across thousands of individual fibers. Long before anyone studied structural mechanics in universities, nomadic weavers quietly mastered many of its practical principles. The loom also determined the carpet's size. A smaller frame produced prayer rugs, saddle blankets, decorated bags, and wall hangings. Larger looms allowed families to create magnificent floor coverings suitable for spacious tents or wealthy customers. Some of the grandest carpets required months of uninterrupted work, occasionally even longer, which explains why families treated the loom with considerable respect. Once weaving began, moving the frame unnecessarily became highly undesirable, rather like attempting to relocate an unfinished cathedral halfway through construction. Technically possible, probably not advisable. Many looms remained standing inside the felt tent for entire seasons. Life quietly continued around them. Meals were prepared nearby. Children played at a respectful distance. Visitors admired the growing design. Grandmothers occasionally paused beside the frame to inspect progress with the practiced expression that somehow combined encouragement, careful criticism, and 40 years of experience. One approving nod from such a woman probably meant more than a dozen compliments from visiting merchants. The loom itself rarely remained undecorated. Families sometimes wrapped colorful woven bands around certain beams or carved simple geometric patterns into the wooden posts. Even practical tools deserved a touch of beauty. Perhaps because they spent so much time together, there is something wonderfully human about decorating the objects that accompany daily life. A favorite walking stick, a treasured cooking bowl, a reliable loom. These quiet companions earned affection through faithful service. Season after season, the wooden frame witnessed countless moments. Young girls tying their first successful knots, mothers patiently correcting tiny mistakes, grandmothers sharing stories of distant caravans, children laughing nearby while pretending not to listen to lessons they would one day remember perfectly. The loom heard every conversation, observed every celebration, silently accompanied generations. In a way, it became another member of the household. Travel occasionally interrupted the work. When migration became necessary, the family carefully protected the unfinished carpet. Warp threads remained secured whenever possible. The loom itself was dismantled into manageable pieces. Wooden beams traveled alongside furniture, cooking equipment, and treasured textiles upon wagons or sturdy camels. Weeks later, after reaching fresh pasture, everything rose again. The same beams, the same carpet, the same patient work continuing almost exactly where it had paused. It was an astonishing demonstration of organization. The step demanded flexibility. The loom quietly provided it as trade expanded along what would later become the Silk Road. Outside influences gradually introduced new weaving techniques and improved construction methods. Persian workshops inspired refinements. Chinese craftsmanship offered fresh ideas, yet the essential design remained surprisingly unchanged because it already worked remarkably well. Sometimes the simplest inventions endure longest. The wheel, the needle, the spoon, and the humble wooden loom. By late afternoon, sunlight filtered gently through the roof, opening of the felt tent, casting long shadows across the tightly stretched warp threads. The frame stood complete, patient, silent, waiting. Beside it rested baskets overflowing with carefully spun yarn, bundles of crimson, deep indigo, golden ochre, soft ivory, rich walnut brown. Every color had already traveled a long journey, from sheep, plants, roots, bark, flowers, and distant trade caravans. Now another journey was about to begin. Soon, steady hands would guide those colorful threads through the waiting warp. Thousands upon thousands of tiny knots would slowly transform an empty frame into a masterpiece. But before the first knot could ever be tied, the yarn itself needed one final gift: color, deep, vibrant, unforgettable color. And obtaining those magnificent shades from the natural world required almost as much patience as weaving the carpet itself. Chapter 9. Spinning wool by hand. The morning has barely begun. A thin ribbon of smoke rises from the opening in a felt tent, disappearing into the enormous blue sky above the Eurasian steppe. Somewhere nearby, a kettle gently simmers over the fire. Horses graze peacefully. Camels chew with the slow confidence of creatures that have absolutely nowhere urgent to be. And a flock of sheep drifts across the grass with the sort of determined independence that keeps shepherds permanently employed. Inside the tent, the atmosphere is wonderfully quiet. No hammers strike wood. No loom creaks beneath rows of fresh knots. Today belongs to the spinner. Before the most magnificent carpet can decorate a palace in Persia, before a wealthy merchant proudly loads valuable textiles onto his camel, before a tribal elder welcomes honored guests onto a beautifully woven floor covering, someone must first perform one of the oldest and most patient tasks known to humanity: turning soft wool into thread. It sounds almost disappointingly simple. Take wool, twist it, and somehow create hundreds of meters of strong, even yarn. Like many ancient crafts, the description is far easier than the reality. The quality of every carpet depended upon the quality of its thread. Weak yarn snapped. Uneven yarn distorted patterns. Poorly spun fibers wore out quickly. Master weavers understood this perfectly. A beautiful design could never rescue inferior thread. Everything began with careful preparation. The freshly washed and carded wool rested in neat bundles beside the spinner. Gone were the bits of grass, dust, burrs, and tangled fibers that had clung stubbornly to the fleece only days before. Now the wool felt remarkably soft, almost cloud-like. A visitor seeing it for the first time might have been tempted to bury both hands inside. The experienced spinner, however, saw something else: potential. She reached for one of the simplest, yet most ingenious tools ever created: the drop spindle. At first glance, it hardly seemed worthy of admiration. A smooth wooden shaft, a round weight, called a whirl. Near one end, nothing more. No gears, no complicated mechanisms, no polished metal. Yet this modest tool quietly transformed civilizations. Long before spinning wheels appeared in many parts of the world, the drop spindle allowed people to create thread strong enough for clothing, ropes, blankets, sails, and of course, carpets. Sometimes the greatest inventions are the ones clever enough to look ordinary. The spinner attached a small tuft of wool to the spindle and gave it a gentle twist. The spindle began to rotate, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily. As it spun, beneath gravity, the wool between her fingers slowly twisted into a firm, continuous strand. Pull slightly, twist, pull again, twist once more. The rhythm became almost hypnotic. Outside, children laughed while chasing one another around the camp. Inside, the spindle continued its quiet dance, round and round, hour after hour. Watching an experienced spinner could be surprisingly mesmerizing. Her hands rarely hesitated. They seemed to know exactly how much wool to release at each moment. Too much, and the yarn became thick and clumsy. Too little, and it snapped. Maintaining perfect consistency required extraordinary sensitivity. Modern machines measure thickness with astonishing precision. Ancient women often achieved something remarkably close, using nothing more than practiced fingertips. That kind of expertise cannot be rushed. It grows slowly, like the grass upon the step itself. Young girls usually learned spinning long before attempting complicated weaving. At first they practiced with small bundles of coarse wool, where mistakes mattered very little. The earliest threads often looked enthusiastic. Some sections were thick enough to resemble tiny ropes. Others became so thin they disappeared entirely. Everyone smiled kindly. No one expected perfection. Even the most celebrated master spinner had once produced yarn that could generously be described as creative. Progress arrived one afternoon at a time. Grandmothers often became the finest teachers. Their hands carried decades of experience. Without raising their voices, they corrected tiny errors almost before they happened. Relax your fingers. Don't pull so quickly. Let the spindle do the work. Simple advice, profound results. Many lessons required no words at all. Children simply watched, then copied, then watched again. Knowledge flowed from one generation to the next. As naturally as rivers cross the steppe, spinning was rarely a solitary activity. Several women often gathered together. While working, their spindles rotated in gentle rhythm as conversation drifted from practical matters to family news, seasonal weather, distant travelers, marriage plans, mischievous children, and occasionally that one camel who seemed determined to argue with absolutely everyone. Every community has its memorable personalities. Some simply happen to have two humps. The steady motion of spinning created an ideal atmosphere for storytelling. Legends passed effortlessly between generations. Ancient heroes rode across the grasslands. Wise women outsmarted powerful rulers. Spirits guarded hidden springs. Children listened while pretending to concentrate entirely upon their wool. Remarkably, they often remembered every story years later. The spindle became more than a tool. It became a companion to memory. Different fibers demanded different techniques. The soft undercoat of Bactrian camels required delicate handling. Fine silk, when available through trade, behaved quite differently from sheep's wool. Goat hair produced stronger, coarser thread, suitable for ropes and sturdy textiles. Experienced spinners adjusted instinctively. Their fingers understood each material, almost as though recognizing old friends. Wool itself varied considerably. The fleece from young sheep tended to feel softer. Older animals produced stronger fibers. Spring wool differed from autumn wool. Sheep grazing rich mountain pastures often yielded finer fleece than those surviving harsher regions. Every difference mattered. Every choice influenced the finished carpet months later. Nothing in the process happened by accident. The spinner also paid close attention to direction. Some yarn required a clockwise twist. Others were strengthened a pintig in the opposite direction before being combined into thicker strands. This careful balance prevented unwanted unraveling. It sounds highly technical, because it was. The remarkable part is that countless women mastered these principles without ever reading a textbook on textile engineering. Experience remained the greatest teacher. Once enough, yarn collected upon the spindle, it was carefully wound into neat balls or skeins. Each bundle represented hours of quiet labor. These skeins later traveled to the dye pots, where roots, flowers, bark, minerals, and even tiny insects would transform pale wool into vibrant colors. For now, however, they rested patiently, simple, undyed, full of possibility. Spinning continued throughout the seasons. During long winter evenings, women worked beside the warmth of the central fire, while snow piled high outside. In spring, they sat near tent entrances, enjoying fresh air. During migrations, some remarkably skilled women even spun while walking slowly alongside pack animals. Imagine producing perfectly even thread while keeping pace with a caravan crossing uneven ground. One suspects modern multitasking enthusiasts might quietly surrender after the first few minutes. The work demanded patience more than speed. There was little advantage in rushing. A carpet intended to last generations deserved strong thread from beginning to end. One careless afternoon could create weak spots hidden deep inside the finished textile. Those weaknesses might not appear for decades. Master spinners thought far beyond the present moment. Perhaps that long view explains why their work endured. Merchants visiting nomadic camps occasionally watched women spinning with genuine admiration. Some purchased finished yarn directly. Others ordered carpets months in advance. A tribe known for exceptionally fine spinning quickly earned a valuable reputation. Word traveled surprisingly fast along the growing trade routes of Central Asia. Quality attracted customers long before advertising existed, although admittedly, a beautifully woven carpet probably speaks more convincingly than most advertisements ever could. As the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the felt tent, another spindle came to rest. The newest skein joined dozens of others, stacked neatly inside a wooden chest. Together, they represented hundreds of hours of invisible labor. Visitors, admiring the finished carpet months later, would praise its intricate patterns and brilliant colors. Few would pause to imagine the countless quiet mornings spent simply twisting wool into thread. Yet every masterpiece begins somewhere, not with a king, not with a merchant, not even with a loom. It begins with a handful of humble wool, a simple wooden spindle, and the remarkably patient hands of a spinner who understands that greatness is often created one gentle twist at a time. Soon, those pale skeins of yarn would leave the spinning basket and enter another world entirely, a world of bubbling dye pots, fragrant roots, crushed flowers, walnut husks, indigo leaves, and brilliant reds drawn from the smallest of creatures. The step was about to reveal that nature itself could become an artist. Chapter 10: Dyeing yarn with plants, minerals, and insects. By the time the afternoon sun begins to warm the open grasslands, the spinning has slowed. Bundles of fresh wool yarn rest neatly inside woven baskets. They are soft, strong, and carefully prepared. There's only one problem. They are all the same color, mostly pale cream. Some are light gray. A few carry the warm brown shades of natural sheep's wool. Useful? Certainly. Exciting? Not especially, if every carpet had remained those colors alone. The Silk Road might have been remembered for many things. Brilliant textile art would probably not have been one of them. Fortunately, the Nomads possessed another remarkable skill. They knew how to persuade the natural world to surrender its colors, and what a wonderfully stubborn world it could be. Unlike modern textile factories, there were no shelves lined with neatly labeled bottles, reading Crimson Number 7 or Royal Blue. Instead, every color had to be discovered, gathered, prepared, tested, and sometimes patiently argued with. Nature was generous. It simply refused to make things easy. The search for color often began long before anyone lit a fire beneath a dye pot. During seasonal migrations, women and children paid close attention to the landscape around them. Certain plants grew only in mountain valleys. Others preferred riverbanks. Some appeared for only a few weeks each year, before disappearing again beneath the changing seasons. Knowing where to find them became an important form of knowledge, passed from one generation to the next. A grandmother might pause during a journey and point toward an unremarkable patch of earth. There, to an outsider, it looked like ordinary weeds. To an experienced dyer, it looked like tomorrow's deep red yarn. One of the most treasured dye plants was madder, whose long roots produced rich shades, ranging from soft pink to brilliant crimson. depending upon how they were prepared. Harvesting madder required patience. The plant usually needed several years to mature before its roots developed the strongest pigments. No impatient gardener would have enjoyed the process. The plant operated entirely on its own schedule. After digging up the roots, women carefully washed them, dried them, and crushed them into smaller pieces. The roots were then soaked and gently heated inside large metal or clay pots filled with water. Slowly, almost magically, the water began changing color, first pale, then orange, then deeper, until eventually a rich red liquid shimmered inside the pot. It must have seemed almost miraculous to young children, watching for the first time a plain brown root somehow becoming brilliant crimson. Nature enjoys keeping a few delightful surprises. Yellow came from many different sources: wild chamomile flowers, onion skins, certain tree leaves, even the bark of particular shrubs. Each produced slightly different shades: golden yellow, soft amber, warm honey, bright sunlight captured inside wool. Some colors required entire baskets of plant material simply to dye a single bundle of yarn. Creating beauty demanded remarkable effort. Blue proved even more precious. One of the ancient world's most admired colors came from indigo, a remarkable plant capable of producing deep blues, unlike almost anything else in nature. Indigo behaved rather mysteriously. The dye bath itself often appeared greenish or yellow. Only after the freshly dyed yarn met the air did something extraordinary happen. Oxygen slowly transformed the fibers. Before everyone's eyes, green shifted toward blue, then darker blue, finally becoming the rich indigo admired across continents. Children watching this transformation must have wondered whether a little magic had slipped into the pot. The adults probably smiled, then quietly encouraged them to stir the dye a little more. Green itself often proved surprisingly difficult. Many ancient weavers created it by dyeing yarn yellow first and then carefully dipping it into blue. Simple in theory, less simple in practice. Too much blue, and the green became dark. Too little, and it looked rather uncertain about its own identity. The best dyers developed an almost instinctive understanding of timing. Minutes mattered, sometimes seconds. Brown appeared more readily. Walnut husks became one of the most reliable sources. When soaked and heated, they released rich, earthy colors, ranging from light tan to dark chocolate. Oak bark contributed additional shades. Tea-like plants produced softer browns. Some mineral-rich muds added unusual earthy tones. These natural colors blended beautifully with the landscapes surrounding the nomads. The carpets almost seemed to borrow their palette directly from the steppe. Then there was black. True, black challenged many ancient dyers. Several methods combined dark plant dyes with iron-rich minerals or rusty metal soaked in special solutions. The chemistry remained largely mysterious. The results, however, spoke for themselves. Sometimes the simplest explanation was merely, "Grandmother knows how," and that settled the matter. Perhaps the most famous, and certainly one of the most valuable, red dyes came not from plants at all. It came from tiny insects. Across parts of Central Asia and neighboring regions, certain scale insects fed upon specific plants. Collected carefully and dried, these insects produced astonishing crimson pigments. The process sounds slightly unusual to modern ears. One might even hesitate briefly before announcing that one's magnificent royal carpet owed its brilliant color to thousands of tiny insects. Fortunately, the finished result was far more elegant than the explanation. These precious crimson dyes became highly prized throughout the ancient world. Merchants paid generously, kings admired them, artists treasured them. Nature, once again, proved capable of remarkable things. Minerals also entered the dyer's workshop. Alum became especially important. Although not a dye itself, it acted as a mordant, helping pigments bond securely to wool fibers. Without such treatments, many beautiful colors faded far too quickly beneath sunlight and daily use. Ancient dyers understood this through experience. They may not have described molecular chemistry. They certainly understood practical results. If you skip this step, the color disappears. An excellent scientific observation. Preparing a dye bath required careful attention. Large pots rested above steady fires. Water warmed gradually. Crushed roots, leaves, flowers, bark, minerals, sometimes insects. Each ingredient entered at precisely the right moment. Too much heat could damage delicate pigments. Too little produced weak colors. The fire itself demanded constant supervision. There was no convenient temperature dial, only experience. Women stirred the pots with long wooden paddles, watching the liquid deepen in color. Steam carried earthy aromas into the air. The scent of boiling roots mixed with wood smoke, fresh wool, and the open grasslands beyond the tent. For many children, these smells became permanent memories of home. When the dye reached exactly the right strength, bundles of carefully spun yarn entered the pot. The fibers slowly absorbed the color. Sometimes they remained submerged for hours, occasionally even longer. Patience returned once again as the greatest ingredient. No one hurried the process. A carpet expected to last generations deserved colors that would remain beautiful through countless winters and summers. After dyeing, the yarn emerged dripping with color. Women carefully rinsed it in clean streams, removing excess pigment while preserving the rich shades locked inside the fibers. Then came one of the loveliest sights in any nomadic camp. Lines of colorful yarn hanging beneath the open sky. Deep crimson, golden yellow, indigo blue, walnut brown, soft ivory, gentle gray, warm camel gold. The breeze carried them gently back and forth, like hundreds of tiny banners celebrating the arrival of color itself. Travelers arriving at such a camp must have been astonished. Against the endless greens and browns of the steppe, those brilliant skeins glowed like flowers after spring rain. Every tribe developed favorite combinations. Some preferred bold contrasts. Others loved softer earth tones. Certain colors carried symbolic meanings. Red suggested life, strength, happiness, or protection. Blue reflected the vast heavens above. Green recalled fertile pastures and renewal. White represented purity and fresh beginnings. Brown honored the earth and the animals that sustained life. Every color quietly joined the language of the carpet, not merely decoration, communication. Of course, not every experiment succeeded. Occasionally, a dye bath produced unexpected results. A hoped-for bright red emerged disappointingly brown. Blue became gray. Yellow faded almost immediately. The natural world occasionally reminded everyone that it still enjoyed making its own decisions. Fortunately, experienced dyers learned from every mistake. Each unsuccessful attempt became tomorrow's wisdom. By evening, the freshly dyed yarn hung drying beneath the fading sunlight. Children admired the brilliant colors dancing gently in the wind. Grandmothers inspected every bundle with quiet satisfaction. The work had gone well. Nature had once again shared her hidden palette. Tomorrow, those colorful skeins would finally reach the waiting loom. Soon, patient hands would begin combining reds beside blues, gold beside ivory, green beside brown, transforming simple dyed thread into patterns carrying memories, beliefs, family histories, and hopes for generations yet to come. The colors were ready. Now they only needed a language, and that language would be spoken through the ancient symbols woven into every magnificent Silk Road carpet. Chapter 11. The secret language of carpet motifs as the sun slowly disappears behind the distant hills. The nomadic camp settles into its familiar evening rhythm. The sheep have finally been gathered together after spending the better part of the afternoon proving that cooperation is, apparently, a deeply optional concept. The horses stand quietly, their silhouettes outlined against the fading orange sky. Inside the felt tent, the central fire crackles softly, casting warm light across bundles of brilliantly dyed yarn, deep crimson, golden yellow, rich indigo, earthy brown. Each color waits patiently beside the loom. But before a single knot is tied, one question remains. What story will this carpet tell? To modern eyes, many ancient carpets appear filled with repeating geometric shapes. Diamonds, crosses, stars, hooks, triangles, angular lines. At first glance, they may seem purely decorative, the kind of pleasant patterns that simply make a room look more inviting. Yet, for the nomadic tribes of Central Asia, these designs often carried meanings that reached far beyond decoration. They formed a quiet visual language, not a language written with ink, not spoken with words, but woven patiently, one knot at a time. No one knows exactly when this symbolic language first began. Like many ancient traditions, it emerged gradually over countless generations. A grandmother taught her daughter. The daughter taught her own children. Small changes appeared. Old patterns survived. New ones joined them. The language slowly grew richer, without anyone ever sitting down to invent it. Unlike alphabets, there was no official dictionary. No respected scholar stood before the tribe declaring, "Today, we shall all agree that this particular diamond represents prosperity." Human culture tends to evolve in much quieter ways. Many motifs drew inspiration directly from the world surrounding the nomads. After all, they spent their lives beneath an enormous sky, among endless grasslands filled with animals, rivers, mountains, and changing seasons. Naturally, those landscapes found their way into weaving. One of the oldest and most recognizable symbols was the diamond. Simple, balanced, elegant. In many weaving traditions, diamonds represented protection, fertility, or the continuity of family life. Sometimes several diamonds appeared connected together, suggesting generations linked across time. A child seeing such a pattern did not simply recognize a shape. They recognized home, Another common design resembled the curved horns of a ram. To outsiders, it might look like an attractive spiral. To the nomads, it symbolized strength, courage, abundance, and healthy flocks. Considering that sheep provided wool, milk, meat, and much of the family's wealth, honoring them through art seems entirely reasonable. One might even say the sheep had quietly earned the compliment, though whether the sheep appreciated artistic recognition remains uncertain. Flowing zigzag lines often represented rivers. Water determined life across the steppe. Finding reliable streams meant healthy animals. Healthy animals meant prosperous families. A winding line across a carpet therefore became far more than decoration. It celebrated survival itself. Some weavers created stepped patterns, suggesting distant mountains rising along the horizon. Others wove stars inspired by the astonishing night skies above the grasslands.